I don't mean to be crass, but it feels like Australian TV this year has felt pretty full of shit. To be clear, I mean that metaphorically, like when Spotlight decided to air 2 interviews with Bruce Lerman, but then I also mean full of shit literally and metaphorically, like when Todd Sampson broadcast his own enema. It's the harbinger of things to come in yet another year of Australian TV and yet another year of Channel 7's Fam Time not airing. Hi, I'm Mitch McTaggart and the year was 2023, the last year of television. Seems obvious to say, but a lot of stuff always happens, and everything happens a lot. It was a year of upheaval for the ABC. Stan Grant stepped down after copping racist abuse post-King's coronation. Then the ABC sacked a bunch of people and restructured, gave Mark Humphries the arse, then lost Doctor Who to Disney after having broadcast that for 60 years. Given all that, the ABC will soon rebrand to Channel That's Just Spicks and Specks and Miriam Margolyes Doing Anything. Meanwhile, Channel 9 heralded the arrival of the new host of A Current Affair with a big advertising push for Ali Langdon, or according to Publicity, Ali Landon. A gold star effort, certainly, but that's not even the beginning. This is. January kicked off with some absolutely devastating news for The Bachelors, with 2 of the 3 final couples calling off their engagement. And I mean, what else can anyone even do for love once you've appeared on a national game show for financial benefit? In arse news, Molly Meldrum pulled his pants down at an Elton John concert after hijacking the stage. That prompted actor Samuel Johnson to go on The Morning Show and vent his own frustration with Meldrum from when he'd hijacked his Gold Logie speech back in 2017.
Maybe it's time to hang up your hat, mate.
Fine, as long as we're still prioritising pants. A Nazi avoided jail time, but certainly didn't avoid publicity. Old mate censored by us, was in court after an altercation with a Channel 9 security guard in 2021. And every year now, we've expressed our exhaustion at Nazis repeatedly being platformed by Australian television, like here or here. So when the trial of wrapped up and he exited the courthouse, at least no TV reporters were there to interview him on the steps. Well, except for 7 and 10 and ABC and SBS and 9. And all of these people. But at least they didn't ask him softball questions. Well, they did. But at least they didn't give him an opportunity to answer questions in full. Well, they did. But at least they didn't film him doing a Nazi salute. Well, they did. But aside from all of that, he wasn't platformed at all. So that's definitely an improvement.
Cardinal George Pell has died.
Cardinal George Pell has died at the age of 81.
Old mate Pell finally made it to the pearly gates, and his earthly departure upset many. The clergy, the Pope, defence lawyers who'd lost most of their income. Pretty hard to choose Pell's top moments, but I think his legacy can best be summed up when he said homosexuality was a much greater health hazard than smoking, cheers for that, or when he tried to slime his way out of admitting he bribed sex abuse victims.
Yeah. You offered them 50 grand to be quiet.
I offered them 50 grand in compensation.
If words have meaning, so you bought their silence.
And as a wild card, what kind of people would we be if we didn't give this clip one more victory lap?
I remember when I was in England, we were preparing some young English boys. They're from very... preparing them for...
But look, whatever you thought of him, I think we can all agree that he certainly touched a lot of people.
Good evening. Straight to breaking news, and there's disbelief and devastation on the Gold Coast, where 2 helicopters have collided mid-air near SeaWorld.
Tonight, we can show you the terrifying moment of impact.
Sure, you can show the terrifying moment of impact, but should you? Nothing a disclaimer can't fix.
Some viewers may find images in this story distressing.
And a warning, some might find elements of this story distressing.
Some of the vision in this story is quite harrowing.
Always good when the news shifts its responsibilities onto the audience, so they can decide if it's distressing before they've seen it, then be distressed while they're watching it, and obviously, by the end of the broadcast, decide to not watch it, presumably by taking a mallet to their own heads or something. Meanwhile, the rest of us had little option but to gawp at the impact again and again and again and again, obscured by us, including exclusive aerial shots of bodies strewn across the wreckage site. While the news had blurred that footage, it was hardly better just because it had fewer pixels. Implied carnage works just as well for modern news because audiences can just make up the graphic shortfall with their own panicked imaginations. Kudos to 10 News, though, who didn't play the crashed footage, making their coverage by default the least gross, which I think is a category at the Walkleys. Meanwhile, the footage that everyone else played, that everyone else prefaced as distressing, eventually came under fire too. Not for actually being distressing, but because the survivors who'd filmed it said they'd never shared it with the media and was therefore broadcast without permission. That raised questions as to how Seven magically got their cat piss hands on it, who also had the gall to watermark the footage so other networks couldn't use it. Because if there's one more thing that someone's death should be subject to, it's the Australian Copyright Act. The Chief Commissioner for the Australian Transport Safety Bureau called the broadcast of the footage distressing and inappropriate. But I mean, has he seen commercial news lately? The pursuit of confronting footage is already so reprehensible that 7 and 9 straight up have news pages dedicated entirely to car accidents, with an endless orgy of content to keep even the most discerning rubbernecker satisfied. Plus, if anyone's death kink is capital city specific, 7 News in particular has separate Melbourne and Sydney car accident pages, presumably to save you clicking the mouse while fumbling with the lube. Even after the disaster itself, the content continued. Networks began racing to see who could do the best survivor story. 7 landed their exclusive interview on Sunrise, and A Current Affair had spent a few weeks following the recovery of a 10-year-old survivor, Blurred by Us, who'd also tragically lost his mum. ACA went to the effort of doing a live broadcast from the family's front lawn to set up shop for some charity, the commercial way. Richard from Instant Scripts gave the family 10 grand, provided he could say Instant Scripts a couple of times.
Instant Scripts.
And Instant Scripts wants to help you. Instant Scripts, doctors at Instant Scripts, there are 120 doctors at Instant Scripts.
Instant Scripts, thank you so much.
Can barely notice it. Big W let them fill up a trolley, provided they were filmed in Big W doing it, provided Ali pushed the trolley, and provided they interacted with Vanessa from Big W.
Have you had a good time shopping today? It's not just toys that you need every day, it's also everyday stuff that we have at Big W.
Yeah, really natural sounding conversations there. And then Westpac generously covered their rent, provided Australia knew that Westpac was doing it.
All of us here at the Westpac Group have been so inspired by following your story. At Westpac, we know how important it is.
Oh, how important it is to try to get some good PR due to the recent $113 million in ASIC fines, partly for when Westpac charged $10.9 million to 12,000 people for financial advice they couldn't have received because they were all dead. The point is, if an act of charity isn't captured on camera, does that act of charity exist at all? I suspect Channel 9 would say no, and then say Instant Scripts a few more times. Just quickly, it's important to note when you're doing an emotional interview to physically touch the subjects as often as possible. Make sure to film shaking their hands upon arrival, like here or here, and keep holding onto them if you can. Keep holding, that's it, not at all disproportionate to the friendship. Put your arm around them whenever you can, or put a hand on their shoulder, or touch their back, or give them hugs in apparently spontaneous footage despite the second camera already being inside the house, or touch them and laugh for no reason whatsoever, or repeatedly give them high fives, that's human, or my favourite, despite someone already there to push their wheelchair, get footage of you pushing the wheelchair yourself. That way it's clear that you care so much that you've made someone else's job redundant. Because to the survivors, a TV reporter is like family. By that I mean they'll fuck off next month and you'll never hear from them again. Grim news heading into February with the biggest audience decline in free-to-air history. Viewers dropped another 20% from 2021, coupled with a predicted 22% decrease in ad spending. But it's okay because Channel 9 got the rights to the next 8 years of Olympics at a cost of $305 million. That'll fix it, a bit of Javelin. Well, if you think wall-to-wall bullying is entertaining, then you'll positively cack your dacks at Bad Behaviour on Stan, a depressingly agonising tale all about the horrors of high school bullying. Everyone is absolutely insufferable, but on the plus side, there's time shifting, so you can see how in the present day, everyone is absolutely insufferable. That said, I do love when a long tracking shot reveals something important. For example, just after this car exits frame, we go to this log, then more of the log, then log, 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 log. It'll reveal something super important. Log, 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 Oh, many logs, that's got to be important because why else would... Nope, never mind, it's revealing the car from the start of the shot, coming back into frame. Still, why shouldn't drama have more shots of logs that go for 41 seconds? Would have certainly spiced up something like Vanishing Act. Sticking with drama, with Last King of the Cross on Paramount Plus, a $40 million dramatisation of John Ibrahim's rise in Sydney's King's Cross. It's the second adaptation of Ibrahim's life after the unrelated underbelly Golden Mile back in 2010. So by that math, we'll probably adapt it in 2036. The cold open in episode 1 is a bit laboured as we time jump from 1993 to 1978 to 1993 again to 1995 before coming to rest in 1987 and having it play out from there. In a way, the show sets a precedent here for time being important. So it's odd when this song is playing over the 1987 establishing shot when it didn't come out until 1990. Sure, who cares? But then, in scenes set after 1990, they're using a Channel 10 logo that was retired in 1988. Sure, who cares? But then, when John is doing some trademark hero brooding, he's inexplicably watching an episode of the Ross Higgins sitcom Late for School. Baffling enough in itself, but that show was made in 1992, yet a newspaper establishes the episode is set in 1990. Sure, who cares about any of that? But then we seem to go into straight-up time travel. The show makes a point at how the Police Corruption Commission is happening in 1995, and John's girlfriend is clearly there supporting him. But when she shockingly dies 2 episodes later, it's shown to be 1993. Weird then that she's at the commission 2 years after her own death, but while she is there, a witness fails to turn up. That witness is murdered, so he can't appear at the commission, killed by this guy in 1995, who then somehow shoots himself in the head in 1992. Dead 3 years before he did it, 1 year before the girlfriend died, but he did die in the same year as the Ross Higgins sitcom Late for School in 1992, even though John was watching that in 1990. One more thing, back in the first episode set in 1987, they're watching Family Double Dare, which didn't air until 1989. Hey, let's give them that one, but the main problem is the footage itself. What the fuck is happening with that countdown? And the family is just nonchalantly sitting on the couch watching time collapse. Sure, there's drugs and violence at King's Cross, but what about the in-world dangers of a clock on a microwave? Science fiction time vortex aside, the supporting cast is huge. Tim Roth does bring some international glitz, but feels like he hasn't really been used properly, especially in this weird composited shot where it looks like they didn't even let him die properly. But hey, absolutely none of that matters because when you've got plenty of guns, macho men, blood splats, and all 3 of those things happening to this snake... Fuck! It's pretty obvious which demographic the series is going for. And if you're still not sure, there are some subtle clues. There were more, but I got titty bored. I mean pretty boob. Yeah, pretty bored. Anyway, now it's time for excessive tits. March. What? Political wunderkind Peter Van Onselen quit Channel 10, and who can blame him? If I found out he worked there, I'd quit too. Whispers that the new season of The Block was headed back to the 1950s, but given the number of straight white contestants, I think they've been stuck there for a bit. Well, is it too soon to make a joke about something if it happened only 2,000 years ago? I hope not, because I've got some real hot gear about Lucius Apellius Saturninus. Anyway, this isn't about Roman political figures. This is about TENS the project, the media's role in playing up a controversy, and a surprise apple crumble. So let's take a bloody look at the lifespan of one joke. The fun began at 6:30 p.m. on Feb 28 when the project went to air. Comedian Ruben Kay was a guest where he spoke of the online abuse he regularly gets from religious people.
I think it's hilarious when someone messages me and says, you have to accept Jesus' love or you will burn in hell.
Which led into this joke.
Because I love Jesus. I love any man who can get nailed for 3 days straight and come back for more.
The total audience for that episode was 300,000 people, so 300,000 saw the joke. But then at 8:09 p.m. that same night, the Daily Mail published this article, complete with video of the joke to its Twitter and Facebook accounts, the latter of which is followed by 5.5 million people, all of which now have access to the joke. 5 hours later, at 1:40 a.m. on March 1st, Yahoo published this story, referring to the joke as X-rated, though also publishing it, as well as mentioning that social media was now calling for the show to be taken off air. Yes, social media, the go-to source of all reasonable opinion. Both articles made it very clear to identify Reuben as a queer comedian and a gay comedian, none of which is incorrect, but when the intent of an article is to outrage, can be a pretty effective dog whistle for a certain type of person. Hence, on the morning of March 1st, the video of the joke appeared on Instagram, which was ripped straight from the Daily Mail article. Note the identical attributions in the top corner. At the end of the Instagram version of the video, there's a call to arms from this guy.
Appalled by this project show last night where they had this they, them, it, whatever it is.
Classy start, let him finish.
Talking about Jesus Christ in the most disgusting way.
I've heard worse somewhere. He urged all of his followers to immediately contact Channel 10 to voice their disgust about the joke. That post got nearly 20,000 likes from his 21,000 followers, which, all things considered, is legit a pretty good ratio. But who is that guy that we've blurred? He happens to be the leader of the activist group Christian Lives Matter. Sounds noble, but almost exclusively focuses on anti-LGBTQIA+ sentiment. And here comes the shit avalanche. At 10:32 a.m, that same video was cross-posted to Twitter by another outraged user, where it's seen another 30,000 times. With those two posts circulating social media, Channel 10 spent the rest of that day receiving a barrage of negative responses, in a phenomenon described in the press as a seemingly organised effort. Yeah, almost as if they were set off somehow by some click-hungry dickheads. At 6:30 p.m. on the night of March 1st, the project goes to air again. Despite not being the ones who told the joke, Waleed Ali and Sarah Harris found themselves eating a big old shit sandwich with extra pickle.
During an interview last night, our guest told a joke which we know was deeply and needlessly offensive to many of you. We're sorry.
Very sorry.
Now, in any other world, that probably would have been the end of it. But this is Australian media, where we repeatedly revive Big Brother and secretly pay Bruce Lerman's rent. So, 45 minutes after the episode ended at 8:15 p.m. on March 1st, the Daily Mail published this. An article about the apology, containing the apology, but declaring it to be grovelling, all while publishing the joke again, in full, with the original video, despite saying it was X-rated another 6 times. Almost like they were deliberately prolonging the story or something. But first thing, was the joke actually X-rated? No. For something to be X-rated, it has to contain actual sexual intercourse. Not innuendo or words suggesting sex, but real penetrative full-blown sex. There is a huge difference between me saying nailed and me getting nailed on camera. The subtle shift in language helped make readers feel like instead of this, it was that. All in an attempt to make it seem more controversial in order to get more clicks. And side note, my sex tape is finally tax deductible. Anyway, 12:47 p.m. on March 2, news.com.au ran this piece reiterating growing calls for the project to be cancelled, and one of the highest profile critics yet had spoken out about it. And who was that exactly? An actor? The Prime Minister? The Pope? Almost. It's the guy who won the block in 2022. Look, no offence to Omar, but if he's the most notable celebrity to be upset about it, was there ever really that much mainstream outrage? Better still, the photo caption says that Omar had almond the project. I assume they mean slammed. Or maybe almond. Then it was of course time for the hot takes. With more and more points of view to keep the story in the news cycle. If a Christian made that joke on TV about LGBT people, they'd be cancelled. Make fun of Christ, but try saying trans women are not real women. No one jokes about the founder of Islam without risking their lives. Or make a joke about Muhammad, Reuben, I dare you. And obviously, they all make a great point. The outcome would be completely different if the circumstances were completely different. What if Reuben was straight and wore a hat? What if all the panellists were spaghetti? Imagining is fun. At 4:36 p.m. on March 3, it made it to 7 News, where they reported on some bishop's outrage at both the joke and the apology.
He says the apology appeared forced and insincere, and the original decision to air the segment was, quote, frankly incredible.
Yeah, that bishop had also wanted to invite the project to church. Not the person who told the joke, by the way, but all of the panellists, the producers of the program, and the boss of Channel 10, as if they all said the joke in unison, which would have actually been pretty funny. Articles also began detailing the hundreds of complaints that were being sent to the ACMA about the joke, certainly making it feel like it was controversial enough to be a broadcast breach. But what actually happened to all of those complaints? Was a single one upheld? No. In an email to us, the ACMA confirmed that after giving consideration to the complaints, no further action was required. Still, no one stops a shit avalanche. At 6 p.m. on March 11, 7 News reported that Christian Lives Matter finally got around to doing their protest at Channel 10.
Hundreds of others here can't profess to love 10's flagship program, The Project.
Mind you, this was 12 days after the joke, where they also could have had time to fly to the moon and back twice, or just stayed there the first time. Channel 7's coverage of the protest, of the apology, of the joke was seen by 630,000 people, double the audience of the joke. So it's really got some valuable exposure there. Also, notable 88-year-old Christian activist Fred Nile collapsed at the protest, thus giving 7 News their human angle.
The headline act among Christian Lives Matter supporters, Reverend Fred Nile, overwhelmed by the crowd.
Obviously, we hope he recovered, but for 7 News to only frame the story sympathetically around Nile, and by extension the protesters, was a bold choice. Christian Lives Matter, and the leader in particular, has endorsed increasingly frequent acts of vandalism during World Pride, supports anti-LGBTQIA+ figures, is anti-vax, and supports the Trump-amplified QAnon conspiracy of the Clinton-Obama-Biden pedo rings. Christ. Plus, Nile himself is on record saying that homosexuality is a mental disorder. And we only point all that out because did they need sympathetic coverage? Especially considering the protesters' treatment of the project. For example, Ruben Kaye got death threats, more than usual, then cancelled one of his shows due to safety concerns for his audience. Dave Hughes was threatened on the street despite not having been on the show for a decade. And for the high crime of laughing at a joke on live television, Sarah Harris's kids got death threats. Side notes, the far right isn't reacting to nothing here. Thanks to the media, with every new article about the joke is fully republished every time for more and more people to see. Second, let's not be naive. Outrage gets clicks, outrage thrives on social media, and all of it fills airtime. So much airtime. I would have much preferred to have used this time reviewing Class of 07, but here we are, talking about a joke and an apology for a joke. And thirdly, no shit that apology felt disingenuous and forced, because it was forced. A couple of God-botherers were threatening to murder the panellists' children. What are you talking about? Look, at worst, it may not have been the right platform for the joke, but, and stay with me here, it was not X-rated, it was not a broadcast breach, and it was not even watched by the people who were offended by it. This guy implied the joke was brought to his attention by someone else, and the Twitter user who cross-posted it said she's never even watched the show. Great. Looking forward to the group's overdue protest of South Park portraying Jesus as a cocaine-snorting, shuriken-swinging Pope murderer. Or that time a Sydney bar posted, Jesus got hammered for his sins, you can too. Fantastic. Which brings us to the big question. Why was there so much outrage for this one joke on the project? On numbers alone, safe to say it was amplified slightly by the media, but Ruben himself summed it up on Q&A in June.
That joke has been told by straight people. Ricky Gervais devotes almost 90% of his routine to tearing down religion. Dave Chappelle does it. Large, big name, straight comics do this all the time. This isn't about the joke, this is about who was telling it.
Miles Patterson from the Australian Catholic University said of Ruben's joke, if Christians are going to tell gays that their lifestyles are sinful, and for centuries that has been the overwhelming position, then they can hardly expect an easy ride from the LGBTQI+ community. For many queer people, institutional Christianity is a source of sorrow and historic persecution. Look, I get why the project apologised, but they threw their guest under the bus while doing it and sold out their own audience, because it's unlikely the Christian right watched the project. It's more likely that Ruben's fans do, and all they've now seen is another apparent ally bow to the same religious people who've oppressed the queer community for centuries. So, all that considered, it was great to see Seven's follow-up story about the joke, not mentioning the joke, but now focusing entirely on Fred Nile.
Religious campaigner Fred Nile has spent the day recovering after he collapsed while attending a protest outside Channel 10 headquarters yesterday.
With the most important development in this entire affair.
The 88-year-old opted to stay home and recuperate, apparently enjoying apple crumble and coffee.
Oh, apple crumble. Did he have a bit of apple crumble, did he? Tell you what, it really balances out all those death threats. They absolutely nailed it. Sorry, I didn't mean that nailed it, though I do appreciate that a small group of you are confused by homonyms.
We know who you are, and we're coming after you. People aren't safe in their own homes anymore. They're a law unto themselves. They're the removalists holding furniture hostage.
As an accountant, he's meant to be good with numbers.
It's the lowest of acts.
Many murderers take their secrets to the grave.
Well, at first light, the howling begins. She calls herself a scammer. He's a dirty creep. Well, he calls himself the grass father.
Nothing beats a cuppa and some scones.
Bruce Lehrmann.
Into April with the deaths of Barry Humphries, Jock Sonfrillo and Doug Mulray. And look, it's a rather obvious example to mention Naughtiest Home Videos, the notorious 1992 special featuring all manner of animal copulation. So how about instead Doug Mulray's appearance on Channel 7's 1993 Supernatural series, The Extraordinary, revealing his softer spiritual side, talking about ghosts.
And have no doubt whatsoever that what I saw was what's popularly referred to as a ghost.
And for balance... Over on I'm a Celebrity, Liz Ellis won, though that was possibly overshadowed by Kerry Ann's 3-day tenure at the very beginning of the series, after she refused to participate in one of the activities.
Why are you here, bro? Legit, actually, why are you here?
Yeah, why are you here, bro? Certainly not to eat those literal warthog balls, at least not without some kind of salad. Seven got ready for new reality show Honeymoon Island. Now alongside F-Boy Island, $1 Million Island, Heartbreak Island and Love Island, I guess the sole benefit of global warming is that eventually there'll be no more of them. True Crime got another dramatisation with The Claremont Murders, a Channel 7 retelling of the infamous Western Australian Claremont serial killer from the 90s. For a couple of years now, we've talked about the confusing relationship between true crime and entertainment, especially when it's leveraging the real deaths of young women for a so-called
unmissable drama event.
I reckon a few people in Claremont might give it a miss. Despite the series being based on 2 separate books, it's weirdly scant on how parts of the investigation unfolded. Most notably, there's a months-long time jump to where they suddenly have a prime suspect with no explanation of how they got there. Yet, jarringly, the show has time for a failed romance between 2 detectives and also manages to work in most of the TV cop cliches. There's the victim's mother asking the detective if he's got kids.
Do you have any kids?
The haunted cop who's going to find the culprit.
I'm gonna find him, Bobby.
Even if it kills him.
Even if it kills me.
And the level-headed boss reminding cops not to talk to reporters.
Don't talk to reporters. Not a word about what we're doing gets out.
Although that one might just be a reference to Bali 2002.
Embargoed information. Nothing to leave this room.
Maybe that's why leaks happen, because bosses forget to say that at the end of meetings. The father of one of the Claremont victims, who's portrayed in the show, was perplexed at the dramatisation, describing the series as abominable and serving no public value at all. Also, some of the scripted dialogue was apparently lifted from the real grieving parents word for word, though the writers didn't seem to pick that many of them. Here's the start of the trial.
When Una and I see a girl around her age, we think of her still.
And 15 minutes later, at the end of the trial.
Whenever Una and I see a young woman of Kira's age, well, we think of her still.
Could they not find more words for their word for word, or...? In May, Channel 9 made a reality drama out of the understandably high stakes of climbing a mountain.
You got this!
This is really hard.
Keep climbing!
Meanwhile, Seven's reality drama aimed a little lower by making balloons seem life or death. And look, if you've got a latex allergy, all of that could be just as fatal as throwing yourself down the stairs or making eye contact with a prominent actor. If you're white, pro-monarchy and completely ignore the horrific class divide in our society, you probably wouldn't have shut the fuck up about a 74-year-old man playing dress-ups with a $6 billion hat. Everything went as smooth as clockwork.
The right people are in the right place at the right time. Nobody else in the world can do it.
Yes, 0 mistakes, and the Australian coverage was no exception.
Very good morning to you. Welcome to this special edition of Weekend Today on what will no doubt be an historic day in London. You are now looking live at Buckingham Palace, the home of...
Not yet, they're not.
Very soon.
Oh well, 11 seconds into the broadcast, not a bad run. Wobble boards, the Hitler's moustache of musical instruments. Finally fallen so far out of favour thanks to Rolf Harris, sometime entertainer, rest of the time total rapist, who died after suffering from neck cancer. The legacy he's left is largely a horrible treasure trove of footage that society can now feel ashamed of for not realising anything sooner, like laughing here with Jimmy Savile, the prick, or weirdly kissing Kerry-Ann, the creep, or crocodile tears on enough rope, the shithead, or this bait and switch kiss, haha, got her, fuck you, or this kid's safety video.
You mustn't be ashamed to tell people that you were touched where you didn't want to be touched.
You peg-leg pedophile, or this hideous line on Parkinson.
If there was a loud bang or somebody said, "Hey you," or "Just a minute," I would say without thinking, "I never touched her, Your Honour."
Ugh, the wobbleboard cunt. Sex pestery and shitty paintings aside, let's not forget that he was a triple threat, in that he also excelled in racism. In 2008, he said that Aboriginal people really wreck the surrounding countryside and then go walkabout to the next place. So he really was an all-round entertainer. And on a positive note, one more sex pest death this year, and I get a free beer at my local. 7 News Central Queensland rode shotgun in a vigilante crime convoy puff piece. Which is so weird because I had this tea towel from home with that exact phrase written on it. The story made the bold choice to frame this local anti-crime group sympathetically, following them around Rockhampton suburbs and looking for any crimes being committed. Plot twist, the locals responded by doing crimes on them.
No car thieves here!
5 men punched and kicked vehicles as a convoy of 15 cars drove past their home.
Yeah, because a 15-car convoy lurking around streets isn't antagonising or sinister in any way. Good thing 7 was part of the convoy, capturing the action.
The first street we turn into, a knife gets pulled.
I've got a footprint to prove that they've kicked my car.
I do hope her car insurance covers damage sustained intimidating locals while part of a vigilante crime group. I know mine does.
Meanwhile, police have also charged 2 people with trespassing following last week's violent protest.
To clarify, that violent protest was the convoy descending on a house that they believed contained 2 Aboriginal young offenders. That intel was sourced from social media, intel that the police described as
pure speculation.
So the group could barely dock someone properly, but I guess they can barely drive a car properly. Still, an appearance on 7 News Central Queensland is the gateway drug compared to the cocaine that is Sunrise, where sympathetic coverage was putting it pretty mildly.
Just ordinary people like you guys having to take this into your own hands, that things might change.
The Premier needs to meet up with premiers of other states so Australia gets back to the country that it once was.
No one wants this in their own backyard.
Yeah, well spoken.
Yeah, well spoken indeed. Let me just fill in a couple of tiny gaps that 7 left out. The leader of the group, whom 7 News was following around like a celebrity, is a former One Nation candidate, and on Facebook he'd referred to an Aboriginal teen girl as filth. Let me finish. He was also the one who'd personally posted the names and photographs of the 2 Aboriginal young people on Facebook and called for locals to attend their address, resulting in that footage of them surrounding the house to do probably what you think they were going to do had the occupants not escaped. Let me finish. Let me finish. He'd also been the national president of the Patriots Defence League, a far-right anti-Islam group with its social media posts referring to Muslims as terrorist scum, rats and filthy. Let me finish. Because, thankfully, the group has denied they are motivated by racism. So, false alarm there. After 21 years, Kochie was done with Sunrise. Of all of his on-air shenanigans and whatever nightmare this is, my fave moment from him was when he explained how awkward it was to get erections in front of his mother-in-law. Always been so relatable. But before he left, he still managed to chat with psychic John Edward, who wowed the audience with his abilities.
And who's the V name, living or past?
Sorry?
V? Somebody has a V name? Your dad is your grandfather? Somebody here lost a child.
Yes, and be sure to catch the V someone has a V name, your dad is, your grandfather is, somebody here lost a child tour, coming soon to your regional city. Still with 7, and network superstar Ben Roberts-Smith, seen here looking uncertain as to which one of him is the real one, lost his own defamation case when the original newspaper expose, which accused him of war crimes, was ruled to be substantially true. And that carried quite a bit of weight. But I think most of that's probably just his chin. Robert Smith, seen here in one of his better Tinder photos, then resigned from his role at the 7 Network, then got hit with all costs exceeding $25 million. So, for someone with such good aim, he seemed to repeatedly shoot himself in the foot. Warnie arrived on our screens, an adaptation of Shane Warne's life following his death in March 2022. When it was somewhat hastily commissioned by Nine right after his death, the head of drama said he didn't want it to be like other telemovies, assuring us that it wasn't going to just be another box-ticking biopic. Not only was that absolutely false, but gives us a great excuse to talk about how all biopics are exactly the same. Go! Warnie begins somewhat morbidly with his own memorial service, which he's also narrating from the grave.
They gave me a state memorial.
It then flashes back to his earlier days in the 1990s. This is called the How Did I Get Here, where a story inexplicably begins at an arbitrary point, primarily to contrast from the humble beginnings that we're about to flash back to. Most telemovies use the How Did I Get Here. Picking at random, it's also utilised in Channel 7's 2014 biopic about INXS, opening on a huge concert at Wembley Stadium and then flashing back to their modest origins. Nine's 2007 Graham Kennedy biopic, The King, opens with his infamous crow call before flashing back to his childhood. Meanwhile, Paul Hogan's Hogs not only looks like he's stuck in a fever dream, which might be heaven given the way the audience is chanting his name, but then the story flashes back to where it really began.
Where it really began.
Thanks, Hogs. Honourable mention to the Olivia biopic, opening with her walking the red carpet at the premiere of Grease. It's my favourite How Did I Get Here because she straight up says it.
How did I get here?
Thanks, Olivia. How Did I Get Here's also served to give a biopic more of an illusion of structure when there often isn't any. Watching an opening scene happen again later on is a lazy way of making the story feel satisfying. Warnie in particular starts and finishes with his own memorial, and the first part of Olivia starts and finishes with the Grease premiere, giving it all an unearned sense of circularity. By the way, I'm going to be abbreviating all these telemovie names. Just saying Olivia Newton-John, Hopelessly Devoted to You, was most of that show's 4-hour runtime. But next up is another staple, the voiceover. Voiceover in a biopic is a very easy way to explain exactly what the hero is doing and feeling. It's especially present in 2022's Vanishing Act.
That, my friends, is a Ponzi scheme.
Thanks, Melissa Caddick. And in 2020's Informer 3838.
I had a fucking stroke.
Thanks, Nicola Gobbo. And in Alan Bond biopic House of Bond featuring Alan Bond.
My name is Alan Bond.
Thanks, Alan. But it's truly present in Warnie. See if you can spot it here.
I was nervous as hell. I was the golden boy. I met up with John again. I just kept bowling. I went back under the knife. I cried. I can't believe this. I was cursed. I was already in England. I wrecked my marriage. I loved it. I was pathetic. I got there. I felt betrayed. I played cricket.
He certainly did. Without a voiceover describing everything in sight, it would have to rely on other things like story and characters, or assuming the audience knows what Queen's Birthday honours are.
I was given Queen's Birthday honours. What's like a knighthood for being a role model?
Thanks, Warnie. Voiceover is integral in a biopic because of the next thing, the bits. A bit is any moment from the hero's life that is publicly known, which is then recreated in the show. Audiences feel validated and smart when they see the bits they expect. The greater number of bits, the greater the chance of validating the audience. In Warnie, there's the bit where he takes that bribe, or the bit where he takes the diuretic, or the bit where he meets Liz Hurley. Biopics are just a loose collection of the bits. In something like Molly, of course there's the bit where he interviews Prince Charles, or in Hogs, of course there's the bit with that knife bullshit. And so, any plot of any biopic is going to feel a bit disjointed when it's just a series of bits. This is why the voiceover is used to glue everything together, and it's also why a How Did I Get Here comes in so handy to give it the illusion of structure. The larger price of all of this is that none of the actual scenes ever have any emotional weight, because we're spending so little time on any bit. Warnie's scenes of his marriage breaking down should be heartbreaking, but have as much impact as Tractor Monkeys, because who remembers Tractor Monkeys? Apologies to everyone who worked on that show. It's also rare that the bits actually contribute to a story's larger plot. For example, in Olivia, the bit when she has the stalker goes nowhere. It's only there because the audience expects it to be, just like when they sing You're the One That I Want, as if the original wasn't cringe enough. Stop! Heading into dialogue territory now, an integral trope in a biopic is the early doubter. An early doubter is any character who dismisses the hero's abilities early on, like when Warnie gets rejected from the football.
Dear Shane, you're not quite good enough.
Spoiler, he was good enough. Early doubters add stakes and drama and make the hero's inevitable achievement feel more satisfying. Other examples include the Cliffy biopic, where people doubt the ultramarathon runner,
I can win it. Mate, you couldn't win it on a scooter.
Spoiler, he did win it. Or how about doubting the abilities of INXS?
And nobody will know who you dickheads are!
Spoiler, people did know who those dickheads are. Or how about Molly doubting himself?
What if I don't know what I'm doing? What if I stuff this whole thing up?
Spoiler, he didn't stuff it up. Well, there was that bare ass thing, but that's 50 years away. Next, a common line of dialogue is the best in the world, where the heroes want or admit to being the best, which is a surefire way to up the emotional stakes. Here's Warnie.
You give up something when you're the best in the world.
Here's INXS.
I want to be the best drummer in the world.
And here's Howzat.
To the best cricketers in the world. Playing the best cricket in the world. With the best fucking boss in the world. The World Series cricket.
Yeah, if you're ever in a telemovie, you're going to be saying world a lot. Basically, every biopic hero is pigeonholed as the misunderstood black sheep. They always wanted more.
I always wanted more.
Or they could be more.
You can be more than just another Australian pub band.
Or they see the world differently to most people.
My son sees the world differently to most people.
Or he's just a larrikin who needs to pull his head in.
Pull your head in, Hogan.
Or maybe they're just not a fan of salad. Point is, despite the claims of Nine's head of drama, Warnie was just a little bit like everything else that came before it. And if all of that's not convincing enough, Warnie is even similar to other telemovies in how real-life counterparts hated them. Shane Warne's family snubbed a private screening, Olivia Newton-John was appalled at her one, Graham Kennedy's friends hated his one, Peter Brock's stepson said his biopic was poorly done, Alan Bond's wife said House of Bond was appalling as well, and Gina Reinhardt threatened to sue over her one, and on it goes. But at least critic-wise, Warnie was unique because it's been the only biopic described as chaotically incompetent. So that is one point of difference right there. July came, as did the robot takeover of all mankind. It started out subtle on 9 News.
Well, we've lost a bit of light, but we'll try and keep going.
Then they sprung into action on the ABC.
One of the reasons for failure was that the people just weren't well enough informed. And so the Attorney General of the day, Billy Hughes...
Culminating in all-out warfare on 7.
Thank you, Gemma. Now, we do have a fire alarm going at the moment, but I'll continue anyway. Hopefully you can hear me.
See, shouting an alarm is quite on brand for 7, so I'm not really sure if anyone noticed that one. A quick recap of the Logies. Sam Pang, great. Daryl's speech, confused. And Sonia winning gold despite having vilified Muslims in 2016, industry standard. Over to the FIFA Women's World Cup with a spectacular welcome to country to kick things off, though Channel 7 preferred to show 3 people talking over the welcome to country than showing the actual welcome to country. And I mean, you could see it if you had a really big screen TV. I just like the fact that they thought 2 people wasn't enough and that bringing in a 3rd gave it the perspective that it was so desperately missing. But I mean, why did they even stop at 3? Just have a whole crowd of Channel 7 personalities speaking over the welcome to country and each other. Well said, everyone. To add to the ever-increasing pile of whodunits based around the murder of young women, this year we also had Black Snow on Stan and North Shore on 10. The latter is a mystery with political intrigue, plus an actor from Game of Thrones, and the former time shifts to 1994, inexplicably using a camera from 2002. Boom, got 'em good. Black Snow has a bit more going on, with a genuinely solid central premise, though both shows stumble to varying degrees in order to make the final reveal of the killer make sense. Sustaining a single whodunit mystery over an entire series is always a big ask. Just look at Halifax Retribution, because not many people did. Plus, once Rob Carlton rocks up in Black Snow playing a smarmy dad, you just know he had something to do with it. Plus, once Rob Carlton rocks up in North Shore playing a smarmy dad, you just know he had something to do with it. North Shore is more of a generic police procedural, with things like the boss always wanting to see people in his office.
My office, now. My office. Now.
And lots of alibis that can't be verified.
Can anyone verify that? So after midnight, there's no one who can vouch for your whereabouts?
But most importantly, some suspiciously recurring background extras. There's this couple in episode 2, but 3 episodes later are sitting near them again. What are they doing? How about this guy on a date outside, then 1 episode later, he's next to completely different characters, but at a different venue with a different date? How about Chino Pants walking with such confidence here, but then a whole 2 episodes later, wait for it, there he is, still stalking the cast. My money was on all of those extras being the killers, until Rob Carlton appeared, obviously. 1 month ago, let's say that you personally scrapped plans to host the 2026 Commonwealth Games. Let's also say that during that time, you ate some food. Well, Sunrise would be having none of that.
Photos released this morning show Daniel Andrews at a long pub lunch during his decision-making to ditch the Commonwealth Games.
Eating food while making a political decision is obviously a faux pas, right up there with invading a small country or pretending to like sports. And it's absolutely newsworthy enough to cross to the pub where Andrews once was.
Daniel Andrews reportedly attended a long lunch just here at the Malvern Hotel on a Friday in July.
July. Reporter Sarah Jane Bell just missed him by about 722 hours. Crossing live now to Jovan Caro at the front of the Malvern Hotel as well. Jovan, it's now also been months since Sarah was standing at the venue. Is she still there?
Nah.
Thanks, Jovan.
Thanks, Mitch.
No one was following the Leongatha mushroom poisoning case more closely than television. Podcast with extra steps and future True Detective lawsuit under investigation conceptually derailed its own premise of only studying cold cases in order to cash in on the current hype.
It's the mystery mushroom meal that has gripped Australia and the world.
And there was sweet fuck-all conclusions to be made, just an hour of mindless speculation with lots of printouts from Officeworks. Business as usual then. Australian drama producers were already speculating how quickly it would be adapted, and critically panned probably, with residents of Leongatha being told to get an agent, as production companies were ready to hoover up anyone's story remotely connected, because that's what commercial drama is now. So, the story of me saying this bit, coming soon to 9 probably. They'd do it. The two best free-to-air dramas of the year were easily Seven's RFDS and ABC's The Newsreader. RFDS is the kind of show that makes drama production look absolutely effortless. Every episode is a smart, beautiful logic puzzle of medicine and coordination that the characters have to negotiate their way around. It's also heartwarming and emotional, and the drama never needs to come from characters being horrible or melodramatic. And, of course, since it's medical-based, RFDS does take the title for the single most disgusting shot on TV this year, and it's this reveal.
What happened?
I walked in front of a dartboard.
Anyway, we could also bang on equally about The Newsreader, but one thing that we've continually noticed with this show is the discourse around it. For example, the newsroom is surprisingly diverse for the time. The chief of staff is a brown-skinned man. Commercial newsrooms in 1986 were not as diverse as the program pretends, and definitely not so Asian. Predominantly white critics pointing out that a cast isn't white enough to be realistic is a pretty weird take, and we're going to talk about it for a sec. Firstly, diverse is a big word here, since we're really only talking about 2 cast members out of a core ensemble of about 12 white characters. But yeah, it must have been hard for some critics to push past that. Second, we know that newsrooms weren't 100% white all the time. Actress Michelle Lim Davidson pointed out that there were diverse people behind the scenes, saying that these people existed because they are alive and they tell us. She also responded directly to the casting criticism, adding, "If you are not happy for me to play the lowest person in the office who is struggling to make a career, well, you should know that Li Lin Chin was already a newsreader for SBS at that time." Exactly, the very presence of Li Lin Chin on camera in the 80s points to diversity behind the camera too. And thirdly, even if the newsreader is revisionist, which it isn't, who cares? The fact remains that it's a show made in 2023 and shouldn't need to be held to a subjective casting expectation of another period, real or imagined. For instance, Hulu series The Handmaid's Tale deliberately deviates from its source material of a specifically white dystopian setting to instead cast diverse for the TV adaptation. Showrunner Bruce Miller explained that the difference was between reading the words, "There are no people of colour in this world," and seeing an all-white world on your television. Therefore, blind casting was the right approach there, because otherwise, they'd just be making a modern show that's a bit racist. Just imagine for a sec that your primary criticism with a TV show is not how well written it is, how meticulously researched it is, or how electric the direction is, but you were distracted by the number of Asians, and then committing that point of view to an article. Well, we don't have to imagine, because that's a real take that multiple people have had. Though I understand it's hard to grasp the specific reality that a show is set in. Sam Reid, for example, would have only been 12 months old in 1988, so he can't have been a newsreader then. Plus, that isn't the real RFDS. I'm pretty sure they're just a bunch of actors. And this show, I think I'm on a set, and I wrote this bit months ago. Help?
under investigation. Good night.
Everything that's shit about this point in society, also known as Married at First Sight, announced plans to be less screechy in the upcoming season. And I think we've got access to a preview. Well, it's an improvement. Sorry, I mean. Channel 10 had two self-contained four-parters with Heat, where Pia Miranda ultimately plays a murder victim, and Riptide, where Pia Miranda ultimately plays a murder victim. Really pivoting there to be Australia's own Sean Bean. Liam Bartlett and the team at Spotlight must have woken up one day and thought, you know who's had it far too easy? Trans people.
Children are being told they should change from boy to girl or girl to boy. It's the most controversial story this year.
What, more controversial than Bruce Lerman's 2 Spotlight specials where he denied 1 rape, all while simultaneously and secretly being on trial for 2 other rapes, both of which he also vigorously denied? Maybe there's some kind of internal ranking system for stories, I'm not actually sure. Anyway, Bartlett, seen here looking like a real estate agent lost at a buffet, interviews 3 people who regret their gender-affirming surgery, and he also claims that we're in the middle of some kind of trans epidemic. Now, we could have easily ripped on this fuckery for a whole hour, but it's not even worth delving that deeply into every part of it, like how the primary pro-gender affirmation voice of the story is mental health advocate Professor Ian Hickey. He's framed as a villain mostly because Bartlett speaks over the top of him for easy points.
You try to make fun of the academic team.
I don't think it's funny
You've
at all.
already tried.
I think the
You've already tried to dismiss me.
And yet, by contrast, child psychologist and trans critic Dr. Gillian Spencer is given plenty of room and literally parrots words from Bartlett.
Pretty much once you start taking them, you're on that bus.
You're on that bus.
In reality, Gillian was sacked from her medical role when she took down a transgender flag in a patient waiting room and began signing her emails with the phrase adult human female in a petty objection of others using their preferred pronouns. Wow, she's just like Joan of Arc. So, understanding that that's the kind of journalistic balance we're dealing with here, let's go from the top. The program starts by deliberately muddying the waters with regards to the age when procedures can happen.
From boy to girl or girl to boy, from as young as 12 years old.
I was 15 when I underwent the double mastectomy and I had my breasts surgically removed.
Okay, note the American accent, because this is American detransitioner, now anti-trans campaigner Chloe Cole. The country is important because in Australia, surgery is not permitted until the patient is 18 years old, and even then is a long, complicated process. So mastectomies at age 15 just don't happen here, certainly not from children.
From as young as 12 years old.
Which Spotlight absolutely does not make clear. Next thing.
Thousands of kids are doing it and regretting it.
Thousands, hey? Anti-trans organisations can spew out all sorts of regret rate percentages. But academically produced studies from universities around the world offer far more comprehensive longitudinal data, such as this study where only 0.3% requested reversal surgery, or this University of Michigan study spanning 30 years where it's literally at 0% regret. That tracked 139 people for 2 years or more following gender-affirming mastectomy. And for the minuscule amount who do detransition, it's most likely due to things like societal or family pressures. Point is, if thousands of people truly were regretting their transition, you'd think Spotlight would have found more than 3 people to talk about it, and without one of them being an American. Also, it absolutely needs to be said, it would be genuinely terrible to regret getting gender-affirming surgery. And without minimising those stories or reducing those struggles, it's important to note that any kind of surgery carries risk. Even something like knee surgery, which incidentally has a regret rate of up to 30%. Bartlett doesn't seem to care about any of that, nor does he seem to care about a cut of suit that actually works for him. The program's other main angle is showing quite a bit of online content from trans people worldwide, blurred by us, and tries to suggest that transitioning is now some kind of social contagion, like flossing or brunch.
All of a sudden, your daughter says on social media, "I'm now a boy." How much of an influence do you think, though, online material, the online community is? Was she getting a lot of advice on social media?
Absolutely.
Urged on by social media.
Internet bad. At no point does Bartlett consider that perhaps despite his best efforts, it's that the majority of people are seeing more representation online and are finally comfortable enough to be their true selves. But hey, maybe Bartlett can't relate to that since he's obviously yet to find an online group for rejected best and less models. Still, it was that use of all the internet content that caused Spotlight's most egregious fuck-up. Trans people featured accused Spotlight of twisting their words and using their photos and videos without their knowledge, especially in the misleading context of transition regret.
Channel 7 kind of made it look like I regret transitioning.
Which gave this news channel an opportunity to completely misrepresent our stories and twist the narrative to say that we're all somehow miserable, brainwashed people.
Yeah, 4 people came forward publicly, and Channel 7 apologised for the confusion, though only referring to one of the people featured. Good try. But consider this, Spotlight's primary goal was to show the thousands of people who regretted transitioning. And so, if we include everyone who appeared in that story, that works out to only be a guaranteed 17% of those featured actually fitting Spotlight's own brief to be featured. You see how fun it is to use statistics? Maybe Spotlight should have a crack at it. The whole thing is such a blatant button-pushing exercise designed to terrify Seven's viewers.
Is a generation being brainwashed? The desperate warning every parent needs to hear.
Oh, fuck off. It's almost funny if it wasn't so grim for the trans community. As Vice put it, anti-trans hate is rising in Australia precisely because of reports like Seven's Spotlight. The article also citing a landmark survey which found that 1 in 2 trans Australians has experienced some form of hate in the last 12 months, and 1 in 6 had experienced violence. Despite that, Liam Bartlett still thinks he's doing the Lord's work.
Professor, I think we're being quite courageous.
Yeah. He's the one being courageous in all of this, so at least we know his ego is proportionate with his giant fucking forehead. October was all about the Indigenous voice to Parliament, or ultimately the lack of it, and TV did a good job of making it appear as divisive as possible. MPs arguing on Sunrise, no surprises there. Kamal was voting no, then voting yes, then voting no. Glad we documented that journey. And Nicola Charles was against The Voice too, spouting various bullshit conspiracies. Yeah, that one really ruins watching Neighbours in 1995. But one of the most baffling encounters was a Current Affairs Ali Langdon versus former host Ray Martin. It was like an old friend going to their high school reunion, only to discover that everyone now watches A Current Affair. Ray was invited onto the show after he'd criticised the ignorance underpinning the opposition slogan, "If you don't know, vote no."
What that asinine slogan is saying is if you're a dinosaur, a dickhead, who can't be bothered reading, then vote no.
What Ray's saying here is, voting no because you couldn't be bothered finding out about it, that made you a dinosaur or a dickhead. Sure, it's semantics, but semantics is not a word that exists in ACA's vocabulary, along with diversity and serotonin levels. Anyway, guess which part of Ray's speech ACA fixated on?
Dinosaur and dickhead, not a word I'd normally say on air.
Yes, save it for your intern, Ali. The show drummed up outrage by making it seem like Ray was calling every no voter a dickhead. And regardless of Ray's attempts to state the yes case, Ali kept minimising the discussion by focusing on the supposed name-calling.
It goes to the name-calling, and when there is name-calling, do you think any kind of name-calling is helpful?
Which also meant that she was repeatedly saying dickhead, which was pretty funny.
Ray Martin just called them a dinosaur or a dickhead.
Well, no,
your word, dickheads.
Yeah, I don't think dinosaurs or dickheads really adds to that much.
Well, Ray, it did add up to a 17-minute interview for A Current Affair, which they then posted online under the title of Ray's Rude Rant. It's hard to believe, but a lot has happened to the show ideologically in the last 20 years since Ray was the host, and the contrast was on full display here. 2 distinct eras of the one program, but now so utterly incompatible with each other, like a floppy disk and a CD, but the CD is just the sounds of people screaming. And don't think the interview didn't have an impact on the referendum outcome. Some cited it as one of the reasons why The Voice failed. Ray Martin's appearance was basically a reverse Frankenstein, the scientist now metaphorically burning in the windmill while his monster creation watches on. I assume that was why Wardrobe chose that green. A quick note on Deadlock, hands down the year's best streaming drama, and I know it didn't come out in October, but I'm not Time's bitch. There's not a single lull or misstep in pacing, it's sharply structured with plenty to sink your teeth into. Most importantly, it's great to see an Australian show actually worth 8 episodes of storytelling. Looking at you, almost every other Australian whodunit. SAS Australia got Craig McLachlan in the... There's a horse in here. In the latest game show featuring celebrity redemption via public humiliation. He spoke of his time in 2018 when he was charged with 11 counts of assault.
There was something that happened about 5 years ago that was shocking for the public and shocking for me.
But not as shocking as his 2005 stand-up routine.
What's worse than poo?
Funny and true. Anyway, among his colleagues was notable convicted drug smuggler Cocaine Cassie.
I want to leave the name Cocaine Cassie behind me.
Yeah, first step would be to stop saying it then. But hey, as long as you've got a past, you're always welcome on the telly to try and rehabilitate your image.
Craig McLachlan, disgraced actor, workplace bully, monster.
And look at that, the reviews write themselves. Whether it be some crystals or an enema where his own little turd Samsons fly out of his ad-savvy anus, Todd Sampson tries anything, no matter how disgusting. Leeches, some fucking teat things, sitting on the board of Qantas. This year, Sampson aimed his cool crosshairs at the wellness industry, with lots of shots of him smugly looking down the barrel at all the questionable procedures. And I mean, it is super easy to mug at the camera whenever someone says some bullshit, like when Sampson told Qantas's annual meeting he deserved re-election to its board. Well, if you've ever wanted to know Koshy's dark truth behind the incident, or how much does a Kosh make he thought microphone was off, chances are you've come across various internet scams using images of TV stars, ranging from elongated Richard Wilkins to thousands flocking to ATMs after Koshy's arrest, but Big Brother being unmissable, well, apparently that one's real. While we're on the topic of breakfast telly, it's no secret that TV viewers are disgusting and poor, but networks can always leverage that desperation by giving them the chance to win some petty cash. The Sunrise cash grab is exactly the poverty porn you think it is. Be entertained watching struggling Australians claw at enough money so they can finally pay their electricity bill.
Oh, it means so much. I've got so much bills to pay.
All while trapped in a leaf blower-powered plastic box of humiliation. And look at how relatable the Sunrise team are when they're egging on the povos for our entertainment. It really helps highlight that people on the telly are normal like us and are just as impacted by the cost of living crisis, save for small details like a couple of extra $1 million in their salaries and probably owning a car powered by human bones. US naval homicides in Australia could finally be investigated thanks to NCIS Sydney. It wouldn't be a cop show without a suspect trying to bolt in every episode. And it wouldn't be an Australian cop show without some shark crime, made all the more appropriate thanks to shark crime veteran Todd Lazance and his other shark crime role in 2018's Bite Club. Maybe it was also the same shark. Also, the show does that usual NCIS thing when they cut to commercial with a freeze frame, but for some reason with Sydney, it's usually whenever a character looks at Todd Lazance.
You're still out there.
Whose arm is it?
So I wonder what happens if I... Interesting. I should stop because it's... Oh. So powerful. December, the end of the year and the end of the line for a lot of things. Studio 10 got the chop after 10 years. Peter Hitchener got bumped to Weekend News after 27 years. Fast Ed left Better Homes and Gardens after 20 years. Normal Speed Ed concluded Millionaire Hot Seat after more than 2,600 episodes. But commercial TV's refusal to address the impacts of climate change in any meaningful way, ongoing. And as we wrap it all up in a bow, 2023 looks like the end of Daryl's relationship with Seven due to his legal action. Same with Lisa Wilkinson in 10, Peter Van Onselen in 10, and judging by viewing figures, audiences in 10. But the year had hope too. SBS quietly kicked goals with Safe Home and Alone Australia. Channel 9 launched youth-focused pedestrian TV, perhaps finally realising that people under the age of 40 exist. And ignoring that fuck-up at the start, the Women's FIFA World Cup was watched by nearly 19 million Australians. Perhaps there's life in free-to-air after all. So in 2024, you bet that everything will continue happening a lot. At a guess, a casually racist thing, a blatantly racist thing, and let's be honest, at least half a dozen shows that Screen Australia probably shouldn't have funded. One final thing before we go. Hate to bring up the Spotlight trans story again, but during one of the interviews, Liam Bartlett said this.
Well, I'm quite happy for you to call me a, tabloid media sensationalist scumbag. I couldn't care less.
He couldn't care less if he's called a tabloid media sensationalist scumbag. Great to hear, because now we don't need legal to clear this song.
Liam Bartlett is a
tabloid media sensationalist scumbag.
He's being quite courageous. He couldn't care less if you referred to him as Liam Bartlett, the tabloid media sensationalist scumbag. Quite courageous.
And all his own words. Okay, bye-bye.
Oh,